The Ledbury Hunt in Worcestershire. In 1919, this hunt had a particularly fine season. During the Great War, those at home had kept packs of hounds going so there'd be sport for the officers when they returned from the front. The Ledbury enjoyed an abundant supply of foxes. Amongst those hunting that season were Lady Sybil and Lady Dorothy Ligon. Now in their 80s, they still follow the hunt.
Sib, there's somebody here who wants to talk to you.
Hello, Lady Sib. How nice to see you out. Very good indeed. Very good. What a lovely sight to see hounds in front of the
Isn't it nice?
Isn't it beautiful?
It really is lovely. I haven't seen the hounds.
Lady Dorothy and Lady Sybil Ligon grew up here at Madresfield Court in Worcestershire.
A large fox was seen in the drive last night.
Really?
Great excitement.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I do hope for that.
We miss our lovely little party.
Yes, but we must have it.
We'll have it next week,
Yes,
shall we?
can we? Yes,
Yeah, I'll
we
give you a
will.
ring. That'd be lovely. Good. It would be lovely.
She's a lovely person. Yes, she really is. Yes.
Can I give you an empty?
Lady Dorothy and Lady Sybil now follow the hunt by car. They first hunted here as children during the First World War.
I remember my first day. I was on the leading rein, and I was so excited I would sing hymns all the time. And the huntsman came and protested and told the grooms to shut me up.
And you do get extremely muddy, don't you? And the way to clean your habit was to put it in a barrel of rainwater to get all the mud off. And so that took a lot of doing, didn't it?
Well, if we were going hunting the next day, it was quite a problem.
Boy had to have two habits.
I suppose one did, yes. But even so, they were cleaned by the footman, I think.
But there's a boot boy, wasn't there? I think
Yes.
In that 1919 season, nearly everyone out hunting knew someone who had died in the war. Over 500,000 British men were killed at the front, and losses among officers were disproportionately high. Many titled families had lost sons. The war profoundly shook aristocratic self-confidence. At the Armistice Day ceremony of 1920, the burial of an unknown soldier was a national symbol of the shift of power to the common man. The war had changed the social order. Through the 1920s and 30s, the aristocracy would no longer hold the center stage. Hunting faced a serious threat in the 20s. Immediately after the war, many aristocrats sold large amounts of land. By 1922, over a quarter of England was owned not by the aristocracy, but by small farmers who had previously been tenants. Hunts now had to pay compensation for broken fences and damaged crops, and they were limited in where they hunted by the proliferation of barbed wire. But despite these constraints, hunting became particularly popular.
They were a generation that had been through the most ghastly trauma in the shape of the First World War. They didn't really know what was going to happen next. There was, financial crises, the great crash of 1929. What was the point of investing your money? Why not spend it? Why not hunt? Why not enjoy yourself?
Hunting had always appealed to something deep in the aristocratic psyche.
The concern of hunting with breeding, the breeding of hounds, the breeding of horses. Breeding is very much a sort of aristocratic, if not obsession, at any rate, preoccupation, isn't it?
They have a stud book which goes back to the 1700s, and you can trace the pedigree of any hound back to that. And very carefully kept, and bloodlines were tremendous, and you wanted always to use something that had a good cry, didn't you? And a good nose. Oh, aren't they all? Blow your horn at them to make them move.
Has it got a number plate on the back?
Your number?
Sorry?
We want your car number.
Why?
Well, what are you doing with that hunting horn?
I'm a hunt saboteur. Oh, hang
Well,
on.
yes, you are. You ought to be ashamed of
My
yourself.
car number isn't here.
Well, you haven't got it.
It's illegal.
It's illegal not to have it on the front, you know.
No, it's not.
It isn't, no.
No.
Why do you do it?
Why do I do it? Because I come from a hunting family.
Well, you ought-
My uncle's a master of the Essex Union, and knowing exactly what the hunt get up to.
well, you don't.
I do.
No, you don't. I happen to have been master here, so I know a great deal more than you, and you ought to
Oh,
be
of course
ashamed.
you would. I'm
Yes.
deeply ashamed of myself.
Yes.
And that's why they're digging out a vixen with cubs at this point.
Of course they are. It's so silly.
If I may contradict you, he's just blown to the terrier man. They are just going down the bank.
No, they're not, don't you?
Well, perhaps without me...
Go on.
go and have a
I
look.
think we ought to let those people
You
go
might go and
by.
have a look, please.
Well, of course they aren't, don't you?
They
So
are.
She doesn't how can she tell? And they're not digging out anymore. Won't be Carson. It's really a class thing, I think, don't you?
I think that has quite a lot to do with it.
Although the League Against Cruel Sports was started in 1924, it did nothing to undermine the growing popularity of fox hunting. The acknowledged leader of the fashionable hunting set was Edward, Prince of Wales. He was famous for his reckless horsemanship. This fall was at a steeplechase in Berkshire. The leadership of the prince brought a fresh set of people into hunting, the nouveau riche. Hunting had traditionally offered an entree into society, but never before on the scale it did in the 20s.
Hunting has always been a kind of social ladder, a form of social mobility. You know, it's a club that you can join if you've got enough money, and if you spend money, people will welcome you into that club, certainly. I think that's true, yes.
The Prime Minister Lloyd George brought this new money into a much more rarefied club, the House of Lords. The British aristocracy had always replenished its ranks by ennobling the newly wealthy. Under Lloyd George, the sale of titles was blatant.
He's got a very bad name, mainly because of the recommendations in his very last list, which was, or the birthday honours list in the last year of his premiership, did contain some very questionable recommendations.
Having paid up to £50,000 for their titles, dozens of new peers trooped here to the College of Arms to acquire the trappings of their new rank.
Well, Lord Vestey first had a grant in 1913 when he was created a baronet, and we see here that he had 2 icebergs in the arms, which are a reference, presumably, to his frozen food work. And there you see the badge of the baronetage, the Red Hand of Ulster. And then when he was created a peer in 1922, he was entitled to have a grant of supporters, and he decided to change his arms at the same time. So here we see the arms, the 2 icebergs have turned into a single iceberg, but 3 eggs have appeared as well.
The ennoblement of men like William Vestey, war profiteer and frozen food importer, outraged the traditional landed aristocrats. Lloyd George also created the OBE, the Order of the British Empire, the first honour designed not for the rich, but for ordinary people.
Some strong traditionalists, who might say even die-hard, protested against the extension of the honours and the much wider scope given to the bestowal of honours. I mean, there's a letter to the Times from a group of such people, Lord Halsbury, Lord Salisbury, those sort of people, in 1918, saying our feeling is that unless the bestowal of honours and titles is protected from this sort of cheapening and is unmistakably cleared from the danger of a peculiarly mean kind of pecuniary corruption and reserved for real merit, honours may come to be regarded as dishonours, leaving no way out except their entire abolition.
Among those who shared these fears were the Marquess and Marchioness of Londonderry. Charles Londonderry was the successor to an ancient title. His wife Edith bitterly resented the erosion of the old order, which he saw as part of a more general corruption of polite society.
The one thing she could not stand was bad manners. There was an occasion at one of her parties at Londonderry House when she was standing there by the band or talking to someone, and on the opposite side of this vast ballroom she saw a debutante stubbing out her cigarette on one of the marble nymphs, one of the statues there. She stopped the band. She walked across the floor with her eyes fixed on this girl. Everybody fell silent watching her. And she said, "Miss Smith-Jones, I think you need an ashtray." And I imagine the girl never did such a thing again.
Edith's daughter, Lady Mary, still lives at Mount Stuart, the family's house in Northern Ireland. The forthright Edith Londonderry recorded her disapproval of the changes in society in her memoirs, Retrospect and After.
Society as such now means nothing, and it represents nothing except wealth and advertisement. The peerage has replenished its waning fortunes from the ranks of those who before the war would not have formed part of what the press is pleased to term society, and it is well that this should be understood.
Edith Londonderry was one of the last of the grandes dames of London society. She made a powerful impression on her grandson, the current Marquess of Londonderry.
Formidable, no doubt about that, formidable. I mean, I was very much in awe of her. She was a very frightening woman, very frightening. And I would hate to get on the wrong side of her. Remarkable woman, a great hostess and all the rest of it, but very frightening. She put people in their place. I mean, there was a story my father told me once of, she used to refer to Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, as that common little man. You know, she was she was a woman of her time. I'm not sort of putting her down by saying that. She was someone of her age, but she was I mean, now we'd call it snobbery, but it wasn't really snobbery. I mean, it's not. Yes, you would call it snobbery, but it was very much. She was someone of her time, and she knew how to put people down.
Edith and Charles Londonderry had 5 children, but their acknowledged favourite was Lady Mary, the baby of the family. She had a traditional aristocratic childhood, secluded from the world at Mount Stuart. Nothing was too good for her. She even had her own garden.
Well, the garden was designed by my mother in 1921 when I was a baby. And I used to be wheeled here in my pram. And then there was a statue of me that was done by a very good sculptor called Margaret Wrightson. It's called the Mary Garden. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? It goes on like that. Those are the silver bells and cockle shells. My governess and I used to spend a lot of the summer here. One used to play with all one's animals, all the dogs. And, of course, doing one's lessons.
Are you good at lessons?
No, I shouldn't think so.
Did you think you were living a very different life from most people?
No, I don't think so. All one's friends were the same.
Lord Londonderry was descended from Lord Castlereagh, the great Foreign Secretary. He had money and a seat in the House of Lords. But in the 1920s, he was facing a world in which political power was no longer his for the asking. When he and Edith were asked to host annual political receptions for the Tories at their vast house in London, they seized the chance to impress and woo the new people with power.
I was 15 or 16 when I was allowed to go. I watched from the top of the stairs all the people arriving at Londonderry House, and the smiles used to start halfway up and go into a broad grin when they arrived to shake hands.
Among the guests was a young captain in the Irish Guards, John Leslie.
The butler would say, your name, please, like that, and I'd say, oh, Mr. John Leslie. Mr. John Leslie, would shout the butler. And you'd shake hands, first of all, with Lady Londonderry, who would be very nice. I must have been the least important person there, but said, "Oh, hello, John," as though you were the chief guest, practically. And then you shook hands with Neville Chamberlain, just how do you do? And then Lord Londonderry would be very nice too, and say, "Oh, hello, here you are among us," sort of thing. Everyone was in the full dress uniform, medals and decorations. Most of the ladies had tiaras. Lady Londonderry especially had a wonderful crown-shaped tiara and a marvellous corsage of diamonds. So you've got the impression she was just dressed in diamonds on black, I seem to remember.
She looked wonderful. She had this diamond tiara, and then she had a wonderful pearl necklace and long earrings and masses of beautiful dresses.
There she stood, looking wonderful in one of the black dresses she usually wore, dripping with these marvellous jewels, flanked by her husband and the Prime Minister of the day in this gallery at the top of this staircase, which all these people, in their best clothes, gleaming with jewels and orders, were marching four abreast. One of her contemporaries said rather unkindly, I think this was Lady Cynthia Asquith, that it was rather like a musical comedy stage, but it was most impressive.
Of course, practically everyone was there. Everyone meaning the society of that time. There'd have been admirals, a few generals, and a few ambassadors, not necessarily every ambassador. And then I remember enormous arum lilies in a great pot, about 5 feet high, which gave out a wonderful scent. And an orchestra played. I seem to remember them playing the Londonderry air rather frequently.
But the parties did not immediately pay off. Against advice, Charles accepted a post in the newly formed government of Northern Ireland.
His cousin Winston Churchill was very annoyed with him because he said he'd spoiled his political career. But my father said, no, my first duty is to Ulster as an Ulsterman, and I naturally must come back to Belfast.
The Londonderrys went to live at Mount Stewart in County Down. Ulster was a political backwater, far removed from real power in Westminster, and all the garden parties that Edith threw could not disguise this. But then Edith struck up an unlikely friendship with the Labour Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, the illegitimate son of a farm labourer. MacDonald became a frequent guest at Mount Stewart and at Edith and Charles's house in London.
He loved being asked to Londonderry House. He greatly enjoyed the company, the rich, the artists, the painters, the writers, the champagne, the general aura of glamour, sophistication, and absolute fun.
I remember when he was made an elder of Trinity House, he was so pleased with his uniform, he rushed round to Londonderry House to show it off to my parents. He loved all that sort of life. He sort of entered it like, he loved it all.
Many in the Labour Party saw MacDonald's friendship with Edith Londonderry as a sellout. But from the Londonderry's point of view, it proved useful. When MacDonald was asked to form a coalition government, Edith spent the day with him at Chequers. She returned with a cabinet post for her husband. Charles Londonderry was now Minister for Air. At the age of 55, he learned to fly.
The Air Minister lands on the deck of HMS Courageous in his moth.
Charles Londonderry proved to be a capable minister. But the continuing appeal of a title, grand houses and a charismatic wife had helped him to political power. And he wasn't the only peer still in government. There were 7 other aristocrats in MacDonald's coalition cabinet of 1931. For the daughters of the aristocracy, formal court presentation continued. But by the late 20s, young women were becoming quite blasé about the whole business.
You didn't meet anyone or get to know anyone or get asked to more dances because of it. But it's just something you did, almost like going to the dentist.
Lady Mary Pakenham was the daughter of the Earl and Countess of Longford. After being presented, she was launched into the old ritual of debutante dances.
There were about 80 girls, I think, whose mothers my mother knew and had always known, and went to all the same sort of dances. And you didn't care who the men were, as long as you had enough and more than enough. And they came on a sort of list, just the mothers passed their lists around.
There were more debutantes than young men, and so they were quite glad to have you, as it were. I remember one night going to 2 balls, one in after the other, and one night actually going to 3 invitations the same night. You just went from house to house.
After the war, there was a shortage of men from good families, and those that were left weren't always the most glamorous.
I mean, the men danced frightfully badly. They didn't know any steps, they just pushed around like a wheelbarrow. And I once danced with a gate crasher at a fancy dress dance. He was dressed as a sheik, and he danced so wonderfully, it made me feel I danced well. And next day I was in a dream. I never saw him again.
You weren't really supposed to speak to people you weren't introduced to. I saw one poor girl standing there for a long, long time, and nobody paying the slightest attention to her. There'd always be 2 or 3. They were called wallflowers, poor things. I don't know if that expression goes on still. And so I went up to her and said, "Would you like to dance?" And she said, "But I haven't been introduced to you." And so that finished that. I had to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you were Diana Renshaw." And so that ended that. The dances got longer and longer as the evening went by. You were supposed to have found your partner that you wanted most, and about the 10th dance, they'd seem to get longer. The trouble was, quite often you were with a partner you didn't want to be with instead of the one you did, and there was no getting out of it.
It was a marriage market which no longer functioned efficiently. But those girls who emerged without husbands enjoyed a freedom unheard of before the war.
It was certainly a different world, because there were a world with no parents in it, really. You could have a great fun as a battered girl, which I did.
Lady Mary Pakenham was even able to take paid work, writing a shopping column for the Evening Standard.
Shopping was money for jam, really. It was very highly paid and no trouble. They just told you 4 shops that had advertised, and sometimes they told you to ask for Miss Somebody to show you something. Sometimes you just snooped round and saw something that took your eye and seemed new and cheap. And it was very easy to write. It was just what you might say to a girlfriend at lunch. I mean, they thought it was marvellous for me to earn so much money.
Wait a minute. Contact.
Starter's got his flag up. Let's go.
With this new freedom, aristocratic women could indulge in the excitements of the modern world. Many girls took to the air. All of Charles Londonderry's daughters learnt to fly, including the youthful Lady Mary.
I learned to fly when I was 12, under Captain Valentine Baker, who was the most marvellous instructor. He instructed everybody who flew in those days. He was awfully good. But then, of course, I couldn't get my licence for 5 years, because you had to be 17. But I think I did more hours than anyone else before they went solo, because I wasn't allowed to fly by myself.
Her father's enthusiasm for the air meant that there was a private airfield and a fleet of planes for Lady Mary to enjoy.
He started off with an Abracadabra, but then he had various aeroplanes. Then he had a Hornet Moth and a Percival Q6, a twin-engine thing called the Monospar. We had a variety of aeroplanes.
The excitements of the motor car were even more potent than that of the aeroplane. Young London society flocked to Brooklands, the racetrack of the day, where they brushed shoulders with mechanics, chorus girls and racing car drivers. Some went further still. The 9th Duke of Richmond, Gordon, Lennox and Auvigny, holder of no less than 4 dukedoms, became an apprentice mechanic for Bentley Motors.
And that was a very extraordinary thing to do for a son of a duke to be an ordinary worker, so to speak, in a industrial company.
His family were appalled by his behaviour and cut off his allowance, as he recorded in his journal.
Day in, day out, 9 a.m. to 5:30, 50 minutes each way travel to work. This was the pattern of things from now on. Solely reliant upon earnings for the first time, and probably the best thing that ever happened to me in my life. A sense of purpose and complete freedom pervaded my being, and I felt alert, determined, and bouncy.
Having to exist on a normal weekly wage was an unlikely experience for a young aristocrat. But within a couple of years, Freddie Richmond became a racing driver. He went on to win several big races, and his family restored his allowance. The allure of speed and the frivolity of young aristocratic life between the wars was captured by Evelyn Waugh in his book Vile Bodies. But it was at Madresfield that Waugh, himself not an aristocrat, found inspiration for his most famous novel, Brideshead Revisited. Lady Dorothy and Lady Sybil were close friends of Evelyn Waugh.
There's Derek Williamson, that ought to stimulate you.
They and their sisters were known as the Beauchamp Beauties, after their father's title, Earl Beauchamp. Lady Sybil and another of her sisters, Lady Mary, were prone to late-night escapades without a latchkey.
2 of us got locked out.
That was in London, wasn't it?
Yes, we hadn't got any money at all, and the only place we could go to was number 10 Downing Street, because we knew the Baldwins. And, well, he was Mr. Baldwin then, Prime Minister. We got in, full evening dress and everything, and they couldn't have been nicer. They put us upstairs, where they all live now. And then he rang up in the morning to my father and said, could he send round a maid with some day clothes for us? And father wouldn't, and so we had to leave number 10 Downing Street, 10 in the morning in full evening dress. Think of it now, it'd be awful, wouldn't it?
Yes, the photographers would love it now.
They would have.
Sybil, Dorothy and their 5 brothers and sisters had a quintessential Edwardian aristocratic childhood. They spent much of it at Walmer Castle in Kent.
Yeah, we all are, with the horrible expressions on our faces.
Yes, we've all got belts on there.
Oh, look at you, you are sweet.
Well, that's us all bathing at Walmer, and as you can see, we
bitterly cold.
Bitterly cold. Rather rough sea, a very stony beach.
It was horrible bathing. It was shingle, and you had to be tied with a rope because of the undertow. It was nothing.
Well, no, it was only because we couldn't really swim very well, I think.
It was the undertow, too.
You were made to swim, were you?
Oh, yes. Even in November, when it was really very cold.
That was my birthday treat, 10th of October. I asked not to bathe and was made to bathe twice.
Yes.
There's a menu from Buckingham Palace. They had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 courses.
Heavens. It didn't occur to us that it hadn't been going on forever and that it wouldn't go on forever.
Their father, Lord Beauchamp, was a respected Liberal politician. Their mother was the sister of the Duke of Westminster. Their parents' wedding present to each other was a remarkable arts and crafts chapel, in which they immortalised themselves and their children as sundry saints and cherubs.
Well, that is my father being Snickler, isn't it?
Yes.
That one. And that's you there.
That's me and my sister Mamie. Mamie's in the blue smock. I think we were each given an artificial dove to hold. I don't think we had a real one.
I think they were stuffed ones.
And then behind, that's my 2 eldest brothers, Elmley and Hughie, in that corner there. And you're above them, aren't you?
Yes, we're above them, Letty and me. And surrounded by flowers. They are very pretty, aren't they? Do you think they faded a lot or not?
I think they may have faded a little bit here and there, but and I can see there's a slight mark just below the Virgin's foot. But on the whole, I think they've worn very well.
And then, just angels, they were anybody, weren't they?
I think so.
The certainty of their world took a severe blow in 1931, when their father was involved in a homosexual scandal. Rather than face a trial by the House of Lords, he went into exile.
And when your father had to leave the country, that must have been a huge...
Yeah, it was quite an upset.
Their mother returned to her own family. The result was that Sybil, Dorothy and their siblings had the run of Madresfield.
We had an old governess with us who, I suppose, kept an official eye on us. But we were really very free, and it was great fun. We could ride as much as we liked and have our friends to stay and hunt. There was a very good train called the 4:45, which left Paddington, much better than the trains they have now, I think. It left Paddington at 4:45, and it got to Worcester at 8 minutes past 7, and then it'd be about 20 minutes drive to get out here. So everybody would arrive in time for dinner.
Changed,
and barrel of oysters would have come down on the train, probably with them.
Yes, it was rather nice.
Weekend parties at Madresfield became a popular subject for the gossip columns, and Evelyn Waugh was among the frequent guests. At Oxford he had been friendly with Sybil and Dorothy's brothers, one of whom became a model for the dashing aristocratic wastrel Sebastian Flyte, the hero of Brideshead Revisited. During the 30s, Waugh got to know the whole family.
He was marvellous company, very, very funny.
How you managed to write, I can never imagine, can you?
No, we were relentless about disturbing him.
Did he hunt?
I think he did come out once or twice, but I don't think it was a total success.
Brideshead Revisited has come to epitomise the glamour of the aristocracy in the 30s. It's the story of a middle-class boy who falls in love with an aristocratic family and its way of life, and there are many parallels with the family at Madresfield. But it was only the chapel on which Waugh drew directly, without disguise.
Angels in printed cotton smocks, rambler roses, flower-spangled meadows, saints in armour covered the walls in an intricate pattern of clear, bright colours. There was a triptych of pale oak, carved so as to give it the peculiar property of seeming to have been moulded in plasticine. The sanctuary lamp and all the metal furniture were of bronze, hand-beaten to the pattern of a pock-marked skin. The altar steps had a carpet of grass green, strewn with white and gold daisies. Golly, I said. It was Papa's wedding present to Mamma. Now, if you've seen enough, we'll go.
But for many aristocratic families, the world of Brideshead was already vanishing. High taxation and an agricultural depression meant some aristocrats were having to sell up.
How can I be expected to keep up this estate with continual taxation draining what little resources I have got?
The Marquess of Huntly, listed in Burke's peerage as the premier peer of Scotland, goes out to earn his own bread and butter.
Well, I want a job, as a matter of fact. I have an appointment to see the manager. I wonder if you could show me where he is, can you?
Well, certainly. What's the name?
Lord Huntly.
In 1936, George V died, and the country went into mourning. The link between the monarchy and the aristocracy was still strong, and the royal household was now one of the few national institutions where aristocrats still held the key positions. Charles Londonderry's job as Air Minister came to an abrupt end when Ramsay MacDonald's government fell. A few months later, he was sacked by Stanley Baldwin, who his wife had called that common little man.
He was absolutely devastated when Baldwin sacked him. Absolutely devastated. and it took him a long time to get over. It was a mortal wound. It really struck him down.
As Air Minister, Londonderry had been aware of the threat from Germany, where factories were pumping out arms. Now he was out of power, he decided to fly to Nazi Germany to see the situation for himself. He was treated as an honoured guest.
One of the things Hitler had always done was expressed his admiration for the British upper classes. I mean, it was a purely specious thing, but this was something he had always said. And, of course, a lot of people rather took this in. And I think he thought that private visits could perhaps help a bit.
I went with him, which was a wonderful thing to have done, sort of seeing all these ghastly people looking back. But Goering looked rather a figure of fun in his most extraordinary clothes. He dressed like Robin Hood. We were met by various Germans who were put in charge of my father, so that he could sort of have a review of all the things there and go around looking to see what they were up to. But of course he was only shown that they wanted to show him.
So what sort of people did you meet?
Well, all of them. Hitler, Ribbentrop, Goering, Himmler, Goebbels, Hess.
Londonderry had several private conversations with Hitler, but he achieved little. On his return, he was accused of having fascist sympathies. Among the accusers was his own son, the current Lord Londonderry's father.
My father did say that he'd fallen for those plausible blackguards, the Nazis. That was my father's phrase. But I think that was being a bit unfair. I do genuinely believe that my grandfather was absolutely horrified and sickened by his experiences in the First World War, and was prepared to do almost anything to prevent another one.
Charles and Edith Londonderry felt obliged to invite Ribbentrop to stay at Mount Stuart.
This is a photograph of Ribbentrop when he came to visit here in 1936, which was to sort of have him here to stay after receiving hospitality from the Ribbentrops in Germany. They flew here on the Sunday. Ribbentrop arrived on the Saturday in these U-52 Junker aircraft. And then the others came over for the day. We had a huge lunch party for them.
On that visit, Ribbentrop gave the family a China Stormtrooper, which still stands on the mantelpiece at Mount Stuart. Ribbentrop visited the family again the next year at their estate in County Durham, where he attended a service at Durham Cathedral.
When they sung the hymn tune, which is the same hymn tune as the German national anthem, my father told me he was prepared. The moment he saw Ribbentrop's hand going up like that, he thought, my God, I must make up. So one hand was like that, sort of prepared to karate chop it the moment he went up like that. Of course, he wouldn't have done that. I mean, Ribbentrop, from all experiences, was a very urbane. He wouldn't have done anything as crude as that. But my father, I remember my father telling me he was absolutely petrified at the thought that he was going to do that, and he was prepared to do anything to stop that right hand going up.
Charles Londonderry's contacts with the Nazis do seem to have been a genuine attempt to prevent war. But some die-hard aristocrats did have fascist sympathies. The Duke of Northumberland founded The Patriot, an anti-Semitic newspaper, and Lord Redesdale maintained that Hitler was a right-thinking man. The patriotism of fascism appealed to some landowners, and the British Union of Fascists was founded by another aristocrat, Sir Oswald Mosley.
And I claim that in the ranks of our black shirt legions march the mighty ghosts of England's past, and their strong arms around us, and their voices echo down the ages, saying onward.
Sir Oswald Mosley had inherited a baronetcy and a country estate at Rolleston in Staffordshire.
As a boy, I think he had felt very much part of the county world of horses and shooting and that sort of thing. He'd been part of that. But I think the First World War altered all that. I think he had he certainly came back from the First World War with very passionate feelings that there must never be another war, and feelings that the old type of government were sort of apt to lead to things like war. And so I think from that moment on he felt very much a loner.
Wolseley sold the family estate so that he could concentrate fully on his political ambitions. He became first a Tory MP and then a Labour MP, before founding his own party. He married Lady Cynthia Curzon, whose father had been Viceroy of India. She too became a Labour MP, and then loyally followed her husband into his British Union of Fascists.
And this nation again and again in the great hours of its fate has swept aside convention, has swept aside the little men of talk and of delay, and has decided to follow men and movements. Oh, there we go forward to action.
But Wolseley had gone too far for most aristocrats.
They're very sort of hidebound, right-wing aristocratic Tories, I suppose, thought it was almost worse becoming Labour, more of a renegade act than it was anything else. But and I don't think they liked him. And in fact, all through my childhood and youth and teenage, I can't remember him having any contacts with the old, that old right-wing sort of aristocracy people at all.
It was Wolseley's political style as much as his political views which seemed to offend other aristocrats.
My father started marching to and fro like Mussolini and singing the songs that the Italian fascists did, and of course that was also breaking the rules of the game, because you were thought to be, he was thought to be copying these foreign upstarts, which in a certain way he was, and looking back with hindsight, was a great mistake, because of course one thing English don't like are people dressing up like foreigners.
By 1938, the Londonderries had reconciled themselves to the necessity of war with Hitler. Edith even saw it as a fresh opportunity for old-style aristocratic leadership.
There is still, what should we call it, an upper class. They still wield a certain influence behind the scenes. In times of crisis, their presence will still be felt. Something solid and very British, and above all, they are people who are born and bred to the old tradition that possessions carry duties with them before pleasure.
It was an aristocrat who led Britain through the war, Winston Churchill, grandson to a duke. His rival for the wartime premiership was Lord Halifax, and there were 3 other aristocrats in the coalition cabinet. But Churchill did not respond to his cousin Charles Londonderry's numerous appeals for a job. During the war, the aristocracy reverted to its traditional role as the officer class. When the war began, Nicholas Wolseley was 16.
If one was at Eton, one joined the infantry and one went and fought. There was no question of becoming a spy in West Africa. That was an aristocratic value. Aristocrats were people, they had a very easy life in peacetime. They sat on their horses in their big houses and they rode and they hunted and they did whatever. But when war came, they were the first people there and they were in the front line.
When aristocrats answered the call of duty, they felt it was important to serve in the right regiment.
There were a lot of absolutely stupid distinctions between regiments. I mean, really stupid, I do mean this. Looking back on it, one would naturally think of either going in to the Guards regiments, the 4 Guards regiments, or one would go into the Rifle Brigade or the 60th Rifles. They were what's called green jacket, black button regiments. We all wore black buttons on a uniform. And the one thing that we didn't want to do was to go into a brass button regiment. It sounds so silly.
Nicholas Wolseley joined the Rifle Brigade, one of the socially acceptable regiments. He was awarded the Military Cross for his bravery during the Italian campaign, though his father spent the war in an internment camp.
I've always feel in a sort of way I've been saved from being typecast as being upper class by my father being a fascist, and perhaps I've been with any luck I've been not so, I never got stuck really too haunted by the fact of my father being a fascist, because there's some sort of blanket thing, there's some protection in being upper class. Sure, it's sort of, that's just the way life is, yeah, I suppose.
As the great London houses and public galleries packed up for the duration, it seemed the end had finally come for the old way of life.
When the war broke out, we thought perhaps it was the end of civilization. H.G. Wells said another world war will bring the end of civilization. And I remember all the great statues were taken out of Londonderry House to their country place, I suppose, or put in storage. And you saw vans outside all the great London mansions taking away their statues and their great famous pictures, putting them in the country somewhere. And barricades of sandbags everywhere. One almost visualized oneself going back to the Stone Age and living in caves and ruins.
Charles Londonderry died soon after the war. Edith designed the burial ground where they now lie side by side. Just before the war, Lady Dorothy and Lady Sybil finally left Madresfield, their childhood home.
Did the war change things very much?
Oh yes, it was an enormous watershed, really, I think, in everybody's life.
Things were never the same again, were they?
No, but I suppose that's what people said for the First World War, too.
I'm sure they did. Well,
and I think it was true in both cases.
I think so.
In 1938, Madresfield went to Dorothy and Sybil's older brother and his new wife, with whom they did not get on. Since the house has passed down another generation, they have become regular visitors again. But the family titles, Earl Beauchamp, Viscount Elmley, and Baron Beauchamp of Powick, are now extinct.